Greetings and welcome to Raven's Roost Forge. This is Tate, your host, and today we're going to be starting a Blacksmith post-Vise restoration. Well, let's get started. So I won this post-Vise at a local Blacksmith Guild meeting in a type of raffle called an Iron in the Hat. And you can see that it's pretty rusted up. And you may not be able to tell from this, but there's a bunch of welding done on it and it's seized up. So what I'm going to do here is set it up so that I can heat the pivot and try to get it unseized. In order to do that, I'm going to just heat it up with a weed burner attached to a 20-pound propane tank. And I'm trying to shoot for getting it roughly to about 500 degrees Fahrenheit, which should be about 260 degrees centigrade, something like that. And then that should be enough to break everything loose, and we'll bring it back into the shop and continue working on it. So we'll bring that in and mount it in the vise to try to get that pivot point moving. Ironically, it does really help to have a vise already in order to do this, but you can get away without it. And you can see that that jaw is already moving a little bit. It just needs a little loosening. So next we're going to try to get that nut off of there. And you can see that this nut is not wanting to really move either. It's kind of seized up, so I get more leverage here. And then I find that the whole bolt is starting to turn instead of just the nut. So I'm going to come in here with a little penetrating oil. I think this is PB Blaster that I'm using right there. And let that soak for a moment, and then I finally kind of work and I'm able to get that nut off. So here we get that nut off, and it's a standard hex nut, so it's probably not the original one that went with this. Usually they're like a square nut, and so it was probably replaced at some point. Now we've got to get the bolt out of there, and it's not wanting to come out that easily. So I just put it over an opening in the swedge block here, and I'm just kind of hammering it through. And then we're going to add a little more penetrating oil to ease up the job, and then try to pound it the rest of the way through and use a tapered punch to get that pushed out of there. So we get that bolt out of there. It's in pretty rough shape, so we're probably going to end up having to replace that, but we'll worry about that later. So now we got to try to get the moving jaw out of there. It's kind of a little bit stuck. It seems like there's maybe a tiny bit of a taper on the pivot there. I got it out eventually after just working it, and then now I'm just taking a file and I'm kind of trying to get some of the rust and pitting and smooth out the inside of the pivot point there. And then I will do the same thing on the pivoting jaw in just a moment. Okay, so we got the filing done. We cleaned it up in there. Now I'm going to take a couple wire brushes and try to get in there as best I can and clean up all the rust to give us a little bit better surface to work with. You can see going through and doing that at super speed there. The opening where the thread barrel came through also needed some work. So I just took a half round file here and kind of just went all around the inside of there just to knock off some of the rust and even out the surface. And so that's what I'm doing right here. So we're just going to further clean this up a little bit. We're going to go over the pivot point and make sure that it's nice and smooth and uniform so that when we put it all back together, it works smoothly. So the pivoting jaw actually was in probably the best shape of the whole piece. There's a little bit of weld right here that looks like it was kind of mistakenly added on there when some of the other bits were welded together. It doesn't look like there was any reason for there to be weld on there because nothing looks damaged. So I ground that bit of weld away. So now I'm back to working on the main body of the vise, and I'm grinding away a bunch of weld that they put on the pivot point. Now that pivot point is always forge welded onto the post there, and it seems really solid, so I'm not sure why anyone put all this weld on there. So I'm going to get rid of it all. And you can see here that the vise is starting to move there, and dropped it, and I actually severed the wire on my grinder. So I had to switch over to a battery powered grinder to get rid of the rest of that weld. And I wasn't able to use that weld or that grinder for a little while because I had to repair the wire on there. But oh well. I guess that was a good lesson for me to make sure that I have things clamped properly. So I cleaned up that weld as best I could. Now I'm going to switch to the collar, which was also welded on for some reason, even though it's made to be adjustable and it is clamped on with a series of wedges. So I've got to try to grind off those welds as well, which is what I'm doing right here. And then we're going to try to get that collar off of there and clean everything up associated with that. So I'm going to go ahead and remove those wedges here. The one wedge is just your basic wedge that's driven in, and it's rusted in place and it's a little bit bent, so I have to use a punch to get it all the way out. The other one in the back is kind of a U-shaped, so it only will come out when you get the initial wedge out. And you can see me you've got to push it forward first and then you can slide it out. And this one also is pretty rusty and a little bit bent. So we will fix those a little bit later and we'll take a closer look at those. So now I'm back to trying to get the collar off. And the collar actually is in two pieces. I'm trying to remove the second piece here. And that piece that I'm trying to move is the part that normally has the plate attached to it. You actually can see what I'm talking about on the vise that is holding the vise that we're restoring. That plate bolts down to the stand and holds the entire vise in place. The entire mounting plate is missing on the vise we're restoring. So what I'm going to actually do in a later step is make a new plate to weld on. But first we got to get this collar the rest of the way off. And it is quite stubborn. Whoever welded it on there welded it with some big ugly beads, and I'm trying to cut through them now with a cutting disc. The trick, of course, is to try to cut through without damaging the underlying steel. So that's what I'm trying to do carefully here. And I just now realized that the sparks are shooting over to this area where there's some potentially flammable material, so I went and moved that out of the way. And then back to work. So I'm almost there, just kind of moving around to different positions to try to get the best position for cutting through that weld. And we're just about there. I'm going to try to knock the collar the rest of the way off with a hammer here. And you can see that I'm getting it moving. And right about, there we go, just broke it off. You can see that what's remainder of the spring was left there. We'll take a look at that in a second. But I'm going to kind of try to clean up where the rest of this weld was, get rid of the rest of that weld. And I did a decent job. I just barely kind of scored into the main body of the vise when I was trying to get that weld off, but I didn't do any serious damage to it, so we're still okay there. And now I'm going to go ahead and try to get rid of some of that excess weld material off of the collar and clean it up so that we can reuse it again later. So it may be a little difficult to see here, but there's still a little bit of a lip kind of where that weld was at. So I'm trying to get on the inside of that collar to get that little lip out and get everything flattened up so that this collar is ready to go. So I've gone back to the pivot point on the main body of the vise to clean it up a little bit more. I wasn't real satisfied with the way it was looking. There was still some undercut and stuff from the welds that had been on there. And I had got a hold of some of the rounded flap discs so that I could get in there into the corners a little bit and round those off, and that worked really nicely. So we're going back to look at the hardware a little bit, and you can see here maybe that the bolt was a little bent. So I got some new hardware to go in there, and we're gonna blacken that in a later step. But right now, oh, it doesn't fit through, so I'm gonna have to drill that out, and we'll come back to that a little bit later. But right now I'm going to finish cleaning up the rest of this vise, and so I'm gonna try to get rid of the old kind of crusty grease out of this thread barrel, and that's the next step. Okay, so I'm just pulling everything apart, and then I've got a bucket of degreaser, kind of diluted degreaser that I'm going to soak everything in for a few minutes, and then I'm going to come in here with like a nylon bore cleaning brush and then try to get those threads clean by running that through there a few times. Now that I worked on the internal threads there, I'm going to try to clean off the external threads on the main screw there. And I'm just using a nylon bristle brush along with a degreaser to try to get those clean. They actually already were pretty clean. There wasn't a whole lot of grease or anything in the threads on this. You could tell that it had been sitting unused for a long time, and it really hadn't been greased. So we're just going to wash everything off in the slack tub here, which has relatively clean soapy water in there, and then we're going to move on. So once everything was dried off after this, I went ahead and taped up the opening on the screw box there, and that's because I'm going to try to use a abrasive blaster to get rid of the rest of the rust and get a good surface finish on the rest of these pieces. So I'm going to go ahead and start putting the pieces into the abrasive blaster, and I'm going to run that and try to get nice clean surfaces, and then put a coat of paint on there. And you can't, I tried to get some footage, but you can't really see what's going on in the blaster there. So I just went ahead and edited out the rest of that footage. And you can see what the pieces look like after the sandblasting, and they look pretty clean. So I'm going to go ahead and get the rest of those parts blasted. You can see I always use a shop vac and wear a respirator to keep the dust exposure down. And here's the results of the blasting and grinding that I did. Everything looks pretty clean. The only thing I didn't blast were the internal and external threads because I didn't want to ruin those, but I blasted everything else. So the next step I'm doing is going and drilling out the pivot point on the movable jaw. The hardware that I bought actually fit fine in the other holes, but it didn't fit through the pivot point. I'm not exactly sure why the holes were a different size between the non-movable and the movable part of the jaw. Maybe they've gotten walled out over time, but either way, this was a quick fix to get the new hardware fitting in there well. So then I put just a little tiny countersink to make sure there weren't any burrs or anything, and that the hardware fit in really easily, and then we're going to move on. And now you can see that the new hardware fits in there nice and snug. So we're gonna test everything out for the first time by putting in the new hardware and seeing how everything is moving. So we're just gonna tighten down all that hardware really well to simulate what it's gonna be like when the vise is actually in use. And you can see that everything moves nice and smooth even without any lubrication in there. The next thing I'm going to do is cut down the bolt so that we have just the amount of threads that we need. We don't have any extra threads sticking out of there. So I'm just going to mark it by taking a little cut, and then I'm going to remove the bolt and then cut the rest of the way through with a hacksaw to get everything down to the correct size. I started with a fine tooth hacksaw because it was binding a little bit, and then once I got a little deeper into the cut, I switched to a more coarse tooth so I could get through it a little faster. It always surprises me how long it takes to cut with a hacksaw in general, but we got it done. So next I'm going to chamfer the threads using this kind of cheapy little carbide chamfering tool, and it actually worked pretty well. So now that all of the little stuff is done and everything is cleaned up, the pivot point is moving well, we need to get to some of the bigger repairs. So it looked like somebody had used a cutting torch to just lop off the post on the bottom of this vise at some point. And we can't have a blacksmith post vise without a post. That would be pretty counterproductive. So what I'm trying to do here is go through and level out the stump of that post and put a generous chamfer around it so that I can get it ready for welding. And the post that I'm going to be welding back on is a 3/4 inch bar. And it was obvious that the original bar was a little bit thicker and it was most likely tapered, but this 3/4 inch bar should work really well and be more than beefy enough to make a good vise. Now remember that what I'm trying to do here is make a functional post vise. I'm not trying to restore it to its original condition. That would be kind of a waste of time because none of the parts would be authentic, and so it's not going to retain any of its value. We just want it to be useful for a blacksmith. So what I'm doing here is just cleaning up both ends of the bar, one to get ready for the welding, and then the other end so that it will just have a nice chamfer and everything to interact with the base that's going to be mounted into. So what I came up with for kind of fixturing this in order to hold everything in position when it was welded up was to take a stainless steel bar, and it just happened to be stainless steel. It doesn't need to be stainless steel. I took a bar and clamped it onto the back of the vise, and then I'm trying to get the spacing right by putting another little thin bar in between, and that works okay once I get it lined up right. So everything is kind of lined up and clamped into position, and then I'm using an angle finder to try to get it as vertical in both planes as possible. You can see me working on that right here. And then once everything is lined up and vertical, then I'm going to try to tack it in place and then take it out of the fixture and then weld it the rest of the way. So it may not be clear what's happening. I wasn't able to get great footage, but I'm just using a stick welder with a 1/8 inch rod, running 70-14 type rod. And I'm just going around and putting in the weld about an inch at a time and rotating it. It's not the prettiest weld, but I'm pretty confident that it's solid. So I'm just taking a needle scaler to get off any kind of slag and little beads and stuff. Now, despite all the time I took to try to get it fixtured so that everything was lined up, I still managed to get the post crooked. So what I'm doing here is setting up a little kind of hot box with a propane torch and some fire brick in order to heat up that point where it's attached. And then I'm going to try to straighten it out. It's not super crooked. It would still work fine, but the perfectionist in me can't handle it being crooked. You may be able to tell here in this scene that it's a little crooked. So I'm just going to try to straighten that out. That works okay, but the whole vise is kind of twisting a little bit. So I'm going to put it in a different orientation so I can sight down the length of it and then try to straighten it out that way. So I'm just sighting down. I can see that it's a little crooked still. So I'm pulling here. I move it just a little bit and that looks good enough to me. And then we're going to move on. So now it's welded on and I'm satisfied that it's straight enough. I'm just going to remove the mill scale off the rest of that post. And then we'll move on from there. I'm just using a kind of non-woven paint stripper disc in order to get off the mill scale. This works really well without actually doing much grinding. It just kind of gets the scale off and the underlying surface is left pretty much intact. So now that a lot of the biggest repairs are done and everything is cleaned, I'm just going to put a primer, a gray primer on there, and then I'm going to paint everything with flat black. And you'll see that a little later in the video, all nicely painted up. But here I am just kind of getting through that process at super speed so we don't have to spend too much time on it. So we're moving on. The rest of it's been painted and everything. So I'm going back and I'm going to straighten out the wedges so that they fit properly. I ended up having to go back and remake one of the wedges a little bit later on. But at this time, I still thought that the original wedges were going to work. So I straightened those out. This U-shaped one I was able to reuse. And then I ended up having to make another regular wedge that was a little bit bigger. But here's the straightening process for both of those wedges. Okay, so now we've got to go ahead and tackle the mounting plate. So I'm just cleaning up the kind of broken piece where the mounting plate was originally attached. I'm going to flatten everything and then put a nice generous chamfer on there so that we can weld a new plate on. So this is a piece of, I think, 1/4 inch thick plate that I just had laying around. That's about the right size. So I'm going to go ahead and mark out the size that I want the plate to be. And I don't know exactly what the plate originally looked like. And that's not important because, again, remember, we're not trying to recreate the original parts. We're just trying to make a working post vise. So I'm just going to go ahead and make a mounting plate that will work fine, but it may not necessarily match the original hardware. So I kind of roughly sketched everything out, and then I went it back through and measured everything so that it was perfectly symmetrical. Now we're going to cut it out. I decided to go with kind of a diamond shaped plate, and then I'm going to go back through and put roundovers on everything so that it looks a little more aesthetically pleasing. So here I'm taking that rough cutout and I'm bringing it over to the grinder to put a bevel and clean up the area that's going to get welded, and then clean up all the edges. And then in just a moment, you're going to see that I'm going to bring it back to the bench and I'm going to draw in some kind of rounded curves so that it looks a little better. So I'm going to grind in those contours there, and then I'll take it back to the bench and clean off the rust and get it down to kind of bare metal. And then I'm going to use a kind of miniature air-powered belt grinder to put more of a bevel where it's going to get welded at so that the weld penetration is really good. And then finally I will go around with a carbide chamfering tool and just chamfer the edges. Okay, and that's the last step there, and then we're going to weld it back together. I just want to take a moment to remind everybody that you don't need necessarily all these tools that I'm using. I just happen to have them, and they make things a little faster, so I'm going to use them. But you could get away with a lot less. What I'm doing here is I'm just using an old piece of railroad rail as a kind of a fixture table, and then I'm clamping everything down so I can weld it together. I'm going to go ahead and weld everything back together, and I'm just using the same 1/8 inch 7014 welding rod that I welded the post back on with. So that welding is getting done, and I kind of just edited that so that it would be through really quickly since you can't really see what's going on. Everything's still hot, so I'm holding it with a set of pliers while I kind of brush everything off and inspect it. That weld, again, not beautiful, but should be nice and solid. So what I need to do is go ahead and grind off the excess weld on the underside, because this is going to get mounted to a stand at some point, and we don't want that weld getting in the way. So I'm just kind of flattening everything out on the belt grinder, and you can see I've flattened out the bottom part. I just left the rest of the weld as is because, again, I'm not trying to make this authentic, and I don't want anyone in 50 years to find this and think that all the parts are authentic. So I'm not trying to hide the fact that I've put in repairs. that's not really part of what I'm trying to do here. So this part has been essentially finished. It's cleaned up and repaired. The only thing that's missing is the mounting holes in the plate. But I'm actually just going to leave that so that whether it's myself or somebody else in the future that mounts it, they can kind of drill the holes in the way they want to in order to mount it. What I'm doing here is just making up a little citric acid bath to strip the zinc off of the hardware that's going to put everything together so that we can blacken that later on. Now I'm going to go through and grease these screw threads so that we can put everything back together and test it out. Now, the restoration is not complete because the spring that opens the jaws was broken, and I'm going to have to forge a new one of those. But we'll do that in a second video, as well as some other little odds and ends that need to be done. But we can kind of generally put everything together and just see how smoothly it's working and all of that. So I'm going to do that now. And then in the next video, we're going to go ahead and finish up this build by forging the new spring. But there was another reason why I decided to split it into two videos, besides the fact that this one kind of went long. Well, I moved partway through this build and moved into a new shop. And so the next video will actually be finishing up this project in the new shop. So you guys will get to see that transition. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video and you learned something. Don't forget to like and subscribe. See you next time, and happy forging.